In 2014, after the Boston Marathon bombing, researchers measured stress responses in two groups: people who had been physically present at the attack and people who watched the coverage from home. The people at home showed higher acute stress symptoms than many of the people who had actually been there. More hours of coverage produced more stress, dose-dependent, linear, with no plateau. There is a reason you cannot stop scrolling once you start, and it involves the same reinforcement architecture that makes slot machines the most profitable machines ever built. That comes later. So does a finding about recovery, that when the signal finally stops, the systems recover on timelines so different that one takes days and another takes months, and which recovers last determines whether the world still feels dangerous. First, what the screen has been doing to the threat detection hardware you have been carrying for decades, and what happens to every system in the body when the signal finally stops. Consider the amygdala as a threshold detector. In signal processing terms, it operates like any detector tuned to a specific class of input. It monitors incoming signals and fires when the signal exceeds a threshold value. Below the threshold, silence. Above it, alarm. The sensitivity of any threshold detector is defined by where the threshold sits relative to the noise floor. A detector with a high threshold fires only on strong, unambiguous signals. A detector with a low threshold fires on weaker signals, including ambiguous ones that may or may not represent genuine threat. Most repeated stimuli trigger habituation. The brain's threshold rises with familiarity, and the detector becomes less reactive over time. You stop hearing the background hum of the refrigerator. You stop noticing the feeling of your clothes against your skin. Habituation is the brain's standard response to repeated, non-threatening input. The threshold rises and the signal falls below it. Threat stimuli do the opposite. The amygdala sensitizes to repeated threat exposure. Each activation lowers the threshold rather than raising it. In signal processing terms, the gain increases with each exposure. A brain exposed to daily threat imagery, conflict, disaster, crime, political crisis, is being calibrated toward higher sensitivity with each viewing session. The threshold drops. Signals that would have fallen below the detection limit a year ago now trigger a full alarm response. The conscious mind habituates. You say you're used to the news, it does not bother you anymore. The amygdala underneath is drifting in the opposite direction, becoming reactive to progressively weaker threat signals. Calibration drift of this kind has been measured directly. On fMRI, subjects with higher cumulative media consumption show lower amygdala activation thresholds to ambiguous stimuli, images that could be threatening or neutral. In lower consumption controls, ambiguous stimuli generate minimal amygdala response. In high consumption subjects, the ambiguous stimuli trigger threat level activation. The detector has been recalibrated by the input. The world did not become more dangerous. The detection threshold moved. You have felt this. The sense that the world is more threatening than it was 30 years ago, despite your own life being, by most objective measures, safer than it has ever been. That sense is the recalibrated detector reporting a world full of threats because the threshold has drifted below the ambient signal level. Everything looks dangerous when the alarm is set to fire on noise. The unease you carry after decades of news consumption is not a rational assessment of a worsening world. It is calibration drift in the threat detection hardware, driven by years of training on threat-rich content. In Bayesian terms, what the amygdala has done across those decades is update its prior probability of danger. Every exposure to threat imagery is a data point that shifts the prior upward, increasing the brain's baseline estimate of how dangerous the world is. After 10,000 hours of threat content consumed across 30 years, the amygdala's prior for danger is so elevated that ambiguous signals are interpreted as threatening by default. The posterior probability of threat, given any new stimulus, is dominated by the prior rather than the evidence, because the prior has been trained on decades of threat-heavy input. A person who has watched the news daily for 40 years carries an amygdala with a threat prior that has been shifted upward by tens of thousands of data points, each one weighted toward danger because that is what the content delivered. And this is why the world feels worse than it is. The prior is too high. Every ambiguous signal, a stranger's expression, an unexpected noise, a headline glimpsed in passing, is processed against that elevated prior and classified as threatening more often than the evidence warrants. The brain is performing rational Bayesian inference on corrupted training data. The inference is correct given the prior. The prior is wrong, calibrated by a sample biased overwhelmingly toward threat, because threat is what news selects for and delivers. Now, the finding that makes this concrete. Roxanne Cohen-Silver and E. Allison Holman at UC Irvine published their Boston Marathon study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The design was longitudinal and the sample was national. Thousands of subjects assessed at multiple time points after the bombing. Among people who consumed 6 or more hours of daily bombing-related media, acute stress responses were higher than among people who had been physically present at the attack. The dose-response relationship was linear and consistent. Each additional hour of media exposure correlated with higher stress measures, with no ceiling effect detected in the range they studied. You have lived your own version of this finding. An election night you watched until 2 in the morning, refreshing results, unable to stop despite the exhaustion. A war that unfolded on your screen for weeks, familiar footage replayed, the same anchors repeating identical information, your body running a cortisol response hour after hour while you sat in a safe room. A pandemic tracked in real time through dashboards and daily briefings, the numbers rising on the screen, the amygdala processing each update as fresh threat. You came away from those periods exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort, a specific hollowness, a depletion that sleep could not fully resolve, a sense that the world had damaged you even though nothing had happened to your body. Something had happened to your body. The stress response system had been running for hours or days without resolution. The cortisol had been elevated continuously. The recovery cycle had never completed because each new input restarted it before the previous one could clear. Signal resolution explains why. A person physically present at the bombing experienced a threat with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The amygdala fired. The cortisol surged. The event concluded. The nervous system began its recovery cycle. Parasympathetic re-engagement, cortisol clearance, sympathetic withdrawal. The 90-minute cycle from activation to baseline could begin because the threat signal had a boundary. At home, the person watching had no boundary. The coverage continued. Each new clip, each replay, each expert analysis reactivated the amygdala because the amygdala cannot distinguish between a live threat and a recorded one. It processes visual threat imagery through threat detection circuitry regardless of source. The screen carries no metadata tag that says, "This happened elsewhere, you are safe." The amygdala receives the image and fires. The coverage runs for 6 hours. The amygdala fires for 6 hours. The cortisol that should have begun clearing after the first activation is being replenished by each subsequent activation before the previous dose has decayed. At this point, the chemistry becomes physics, because cortisol follows measurable decay kinetics. Cortisol's biological half-life in blood plasma is approximately 66 minutes. After a single acute stress event, cortisol concentration follows an exponential decay curve, dropping by half every 66 minutes until it returns to baseline. The mathematics of exponential decay is precise. After one half-life, 50% remains. After 2 half-lives, 25%. After 3, 12.5%. Full clearance to baseline takes roughly 4 to 5 half-lives, about 5 to 6 hours for a single acute cortisol surge. Now consider what happens when the input rate exceeds the clearance rate. If a new threat activation arrives every 15 or 20 minutes, which is approximately the frequency of distressing content in continuous news coverage, each activation delivers a fresh cortisol pulse before the previous pulse has fully decayed. The cortisol level does not return to baseline between pulses. It ratchets upward. each pulse adding to the residual from the previous one, the way filling a bathtub faster than it drains raises the water level even though water is leaving continuously. After 6 hours of continuous news consumption, the cortisol level is not at baseline plus 1 pulse. It is at a chronically elevated plateau, the steady state concentration reached when input rate and clearance rate find equilibrium at a level far above the resting baseline. Apply that math to an evening of news. The cortisol circulating at 10 in the evening has a half-life of 66 minutes. At 11:30, 50% remains. At 1 in the morning, 25%. At 2:30, 12.5%, still elevated above the overnight minimum that sleep architecture requires. The waking at 3 in the morning that follows an evening of distressing content is not anxiety in any psychological sense. It is the tail of an exponential decay curve intersecting with the sleep cycle at the precise point where the residual cortisol exceeds the threshold for cortical arousal. The chemistry has a clock. The clock does not care that you decided to stop worrying. You know this waking. The specific quality of it, not worry about a particular problem, but a diffuse activation, a sense of alertness that has no object, a body that is awake and does not know why. You lie there and your mind reaches for something to attach the wakefulness to. A problem at work, a family concern, something from tomorrow's schedule. But the wakefulness arrived before the thought. The activation came first. The mind supplied the content afterward. That sequence is the signature of cortisol-mediated arousal. The chemistry wakes you, and the prefrontal cortex, finding itself awake, searches for a reason. The reason it finds is whatever concern is most available. But the concern did not cause the waking. The cortisol caused the waking. The concern was recruited after the fact to explain a state that was already underway. The screen went dark at 10. The chemistry is still running at 3. And the connection between the two is invisible because the half-life bridges them with a delay the brain does not naturally link. This is the finding that changed how I understand what the screen does to me. Because the decay kinetics mean the cost is paid hours after the consumption ends, in a currency the conscious mind cannot track. You do not feel the cortisol, you feel the insomnia, the unease, the morning fatigue. For years you can watch the news every evening and wake poorly every night and never connect the two, because the cause and effect are separated by 4 hours and a chemical decay curve that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. Once you see the connection. Once the decay, kinetics make the bridge visible, you cannot unsee it. Every evening of distressing content is a cortisol deposit. Every night of disrupted sleep is the withdrawal. The transaction was always happening. The ledger was always being kept. You are seeing it for the first time. One layer remains, the deepest, because the question of why you cannot stop watching involves a different physics entirely. News scrolls operate on variable ratio reinforcement, a schedule identified by B.F. Skinner as the most powerful pattern for sustaining behavior and the most resistant to extinction. In information, theoretic terms, variable ratio reinforcement maximizes Shannon entropy in the reward signal. Shannon defined information content as the inverse of predictability. The less predictable a signal, the more information it carries. A reward that arrives on a fixed schedule carries low information because the timing is predictable. A reward that arrives unpredictably carries maximum information because each moment contains genuine uncertainty about whether the reward will appear. Dopamine neurons in the nucleus accumbens respond to information content, and their strongest signal, the sharpest dopamine spike, occurs in conditions of maximum reward uncertainty. A predictable reward generates a moderate dopamine response. An unpredictable reward of identical value generates a significantly larger response, because the prediction error is larger. The dopamine signal is proportional to the surprise, and maximum surprise comes from maximum unpredictability. A news scroll delivers rewards, important stories, surprising developments, emotionally compelling content on a variable ratio schedule embedded in a stream of neutral or mildly negative content. The brain cannot predict when the next significant story will appear. Each scroll down is a pull of the lever. Most yield nothing rewarding. Occasionally one triggers a genuine dopamine spike, a story that matters, a development that changes something, information that feels important. The unpredictability of that reward, delivered against a background of unrewarding content, drives the highest intensity dopamine reinforcement signal the nucleus accumbens generates. Anyone who has picked up their phone to check the headlines for 5 minutes and found themselves still scrolling 40 minutes later was inside this loop. The dopamine system is generating seek more signals after each scroll because the variable schedule maintains the prediction that the next reward might be imminent. Stopping requires overriding the dopamine signal with prefrontal executive control, and prefrontal function has been partially suppressed by the cortisol from the threat content the amygdala has been processing throughout the scrolling session. The architecture is working against itself. The content activates threat processing that suppresses the executive function needed to stop consuming the content. The trap is neurochemically self-reinforcing. From inside, the trap has a specific quality. The scrolling does not feel good. The content is mostly distressing. Conflict, threat, outrage, loss. The dopamine is not producing pleasure. It is driving seeking, the pull toward the next item, the feeling that stopping now would mean missing something. That difference between seeking and enjoying is the key to the trap. People describe their news consumption as compulsive rather than enjoyable. They do not enjoy it. They cannot stop it. That is the signature of dopamine-driven seeking dissociated from pleasure, the wanting without the liking that Burrage and Robinson identified as the core mechanism of compulsive behavior. The dopamine system drives approach. It does not require that the approach produce satisfaction. It requires only unpredictable reward on a variable schedule, and the news feed delivers exactly that. Behavioral neuroscience has studied extinction of variable ratio reinforcement extensively because of its relevance to gambling addiction. Variable ratio schedules generate the highest response rates and the greatest resistance to extinction of any reinforcement pattern. The inability to stop scrolling is the expected behavioral output of a nervous system operating under variable ratio dopamine reinforcement. The phone in your hand, with its infinite scroll and its unpredictable delivery of compelling content, is running the most effective behavioral reinforcement architecture known to psychology. The architecture slot machines have used for decades, now delivered to every pocket, every bedside table, every waking moment. That architecture was designed for casinos. It is now standard in news delivery. Underneath all of this, the HPA axis, the body's central stress response system, is running as a feedback control loop. In engineering terms, the HPA axis operates as a negative feedback system. Cortisol released by the adrenal glands feeds back to the hypothalamus and pituitary, suppressing further CRH and ACTH release, which reduces cortisol production. The feedback loop is designed to be self-limiting. The output suppresses the input, preventing runaway activation. Under acute stress, this works. Cortisol surges, feeds back, and the system returns to baseline. Under chronic activation, the kind driven by daily news consumption across years, the feedback loop degrades. The glucocorticoid receptors in the hypothalamus that detect cortisol and initiate the suppressive feedback become less sensitive through downregulation, fewer receptors, reduced binding affinity, weaker feedback signal. The system loses its ability to self-limit. The gain increases. The cortisol baseline drifts upward because the feedback that should be pulling it down has weakened. In control systems engineering, this is gain saturation. The feedback mechanism has been overwhelmed by the sustained input, and the system operates at a higher steady state than its design parameters intended. The diurnal cortisol rhythm, the natural pattern of high cortisol in the morning and low cortisol in the evening, that healthy HPA axis function maintains, flattens under chronic activation. The morning peak is blunted because the system is already partially activated. The evening trough is elevated because the feedback that should suppress nighttime cortisol has lost sensitivity. The result is a flatter curve. Less variation between peak and trough, which is one of the most reliable biomarkers of chronic stress identified in endocrine research. Your body is running this system right now. If you have consumed news daily for decades, television, radio, digital, in any combination, your HPA axis has been receiving chronic threat input for years. The feedback sensitivity may have degraded. The cortisol baseline may have drifted upward. The diurnal rhythm may have flattened. The cardiovascular consequences of sustained cortisol elevation, higher resting blood pressure, reduced heart rate variability, increased arterial stiffness, accumulate silently across years. None of this creates symptoms that announce themselves as caused by news consumption. It creates symptoms that feel like aging, like stress, like the way things are, the elevated blood pressure your doctor monitors, the sleep disruption you have learned to live with, the background anxiety that seems to have no specific cause, the sense that the world is deteriorating in ways you cannot quite articulate but feel in your body every evening. You attribute these to getting older, to the state of the world, to the accumulation of life's pressures. Some of that attribution is correct. Some of it is the chronic threat signal from the screen, folded into the background of daily experience, unattributed and unaddressed, because the connection between the content and the cost was never made visible. The screen was generating a measurable physiological expense that was being paid in cortisol, in inflammatory load, in cardiovascular wear, every day for years. Each system recovers on its own timeline when the signal stops, some in days, one measured in months. And each recovery follows its own kinetics. Heart rate variability and cortisol rhythm recover first, both driven by the HPA axis recalibrating once the chronic input stops. HRV begins improving within days as the parasympathetic nervous system re-engages and the vagus nerve resumes modulation of cardiac rhythm. What the viewer notices is a subtle shift in how their body feels at rest, less tension in the chest, easier breathing, the sense that something has loosened without being able to name what changed. Cortisol rhythm normalization follows over weeks as the glucocorticoid receptors in the hypothalamus upregulate, increasing receptor density and binding affinity until the feedback loop regains its self-limiting function. By the second or third week, the mornings feel different. More alert on waking, more energetic in the first hours, less of the flat depleted quality that a blunted morning cortisol peak generates. The evenings shift too. The winding down happens more naturally, the body moving toward rest without the elevated baseline that had been preventing full relaxation. Sleep architecture improves as the cortisol rhythm normalizes. The evening trough deepens, the overnight minimum drops to the level that sleep requires, and the 3 a.m. waking ceases because the decay curve no longer intersects the arousal threshold during the sleep window. The improvement in sleep feels disproportionate to the change that caused it, because the cortisol disruption was causing sleep disturbance every night, and its removal allows improvement every night. The effect compounds. Better sleep lowers daytime cortisol. Lower daytime cortisol deepens sleep. The positive feedback loop that had been working against the viewer reverses direction and begins working for them. Amygdala sensitization is the slowest to reverse. Learned threat associations do not simply fade with the absence of input. They require active extinction, which means exposure to former threat-associated cues without threat outcomes. The amygdala must encounter the kinds of stimuli that have been paired with threat, ambiguous images, unexpected sounds, unfamiliar situations, and process them without the threat signal arriving. Each non-threatening encounter weakens the sensitized response incrementally. The time constant for amygdala extinction is measured in months, and the process requires the brain to be in environments where ambiguous stimuli are encountered and resolved as non-threatening. This is why time in nature, quiet social settings, and low stimulation environments creates a qualitative shift that feels out of proportion to what the person is doing. Walking in a forest presents the amygdala with thousands of ambiguous stimuli, rustling sounds, moving shadows, unfamiliar shapes, and resolves each one as non-threatening. Each resolution is a small extinction trial. Over days and weeks, the accumulated trials begin reversing the sensitization that years of threat-rich media had built. The threshold drifts upward. Ambiguous stimuli begin resolving as neutral again. The world starts to feel less threatening, not because the threats have changed, but because the detector is recalibrating toward a higher threshold. The person does not experience this as, "My amygdala is extinguishing learned threat associations." They experience it as peace. Stephen Kaplan's attention restoration theory describes the final piece. The prefrontal cortex requires periods of low demand, non-threat relevant stimulation to restore its directed attention capacity. The executive resources consumed by continuous threat monitoring, the sustained vigilance, the constant evaluation of incoming information for danger, are finite, and they deplete with sustained use. When the threat input stops, those resources become available for other functions: planning, reflection, creative problem solving, the kind of sustained focus that continuous partial attention to threat had been consuming, the specific quality of mental clarity that arrives after a period away from news, the sense that problems are more manageable, that the mind is quieter, that the catastrophic urgency of last week's headlines has faded, is prefrontal restoration. The cognitive resources are back. The world has not changed. The brain has recovered the capacity to evaluate it calmly. Being informed and being chronically activated are different states that feel similar from inside. Both involve awareness of what is happening in the world. The difference is biological, episodic exposure. Reading, processing, integrating information into an updated understanding at the speed of comprehension creates an informed person whose stress physiology returns to baseline between exposures. Continuous exposure. Scrolling, watching, refreshing, consuming content delivered at the speed of engagement rather than understanding creates a chronically activated person whose stress physiology never fully returns to baseline because the next input arrives before the previous recovery completes. Specific formats map to each side of this distinction. A newspaper read for 30 minutes and then set aside is episodic. The reader processes the information, the stress response activates briefly on threatening content, the paper is closed, and recovery begins. A 24-hour news channel playing in the background while you cook dinner is continuous. The amygdala processes each threat segment, the cortisol pulses arrive faster than they clear, and the background activation persists for as long as the screen is on. A curated email newsletter read once in the morning is episodic. A news app with push notifications that interrupt you 12 times a day is continuous. Each notification is a micro-activation, each one delivering a small cortisol pulse, the cumulative effect across a day of interruptions equivalent to a sustained low-grade threat signal. A person who reads a newspaper for 30 minutes and then closes it has processed information. A person who scrolls a news feed for 3 hours has been running a threat response for 3 hours, with cortisol following its decay, kinetics on top of each new pulse, the amygdala sensitizing with each threatening image, the dopamine loop sustaining the behavior past the point of informational value. The information acquired may overlap. The biological cost does not. You are the person this video is about. If you have watched the news daily for 30 years, and most people watching this have, your amygdala's threat threshold has been drifting downward for 3 decades. Your cortisol baseline has been nudged upward by chronic HPA axis activation with degraded feedback. Your sleep has been disrupted by cortisol decay curves that bridge the gap between the evening's content and the night's arousal. Your sense that the world is more dangerous than it used to be is, in measurable part, a consequence of the detection hardware being recalibrated by the content it was asked to process. The world contains the threats it has always contained. The delivery system changed, continuous, unresolvable, engineered for engagement through variable ratio dopamine reinforcement on a platform designed to prevent stopping. The brain adapted to the delivery system, and the adaptation made the world feel worse than it is, because a sensitized detector in a noisy environment reports threat everywhere it looks. When the signal stops, when you step away, not forever, not into ignorance, but long enough for the systems to recover on their own timescales. Cardiac variability improves in days. The cortisol rhythm recalibrates in weeks. Sleep deepens as the evening trough returns. The amygdala's threshold begins drifting back upward as non-threatening encounters accumulate without reinforcement. The prefrontal cortex recovers the attentional capacity that threat monitoring had consumed. A week brings the first measurable changes. A month brings changes you can feel. 3 months brings a person whose threat detection system has been substantially recalibrated by the absence of the input that had been driving it for decades. And the world with the same problems, carrying the same risks, looks different, because the instrument you were using to measure it has been recalibrated. And a recalibrated instrument, it turns out, reports a different world.